I'm Kristin Bezio. I'm here with Professor Giles Gunn for the 2013-2014 Jepson School of Leadership Studies Leadership Forum. Our theme this year is Culture Shock, the Art of Leading Society. And Professor Gunn is a cultural critic who is joining us today, and we're going to talk a little bit about culture, leadership, global culture, those kind of things. I'd like to just get started by asking you how you define in your work what culture is.
Well, I tend to think of culture as a system or set of systems of meanings that we use to try to make sense out of the experiences we confront, or at least to turn those raw materials into symbolic kinds of expressions or vehicles that allow us to then negotiate them, to see how they work, what we can make of them, how we can respond to them.
And in some of your work that I haven't read a lot of it, but I have read some of your work, and you talk a lot, at least in the piece that I looked at, about the problem sort of negotiating between cultures and sort of intercultures. Can you say a little bit for us about how the differences in culture sort of relate to problems or concerns of leadership, particularly on a global scale?
Well, I think one of the first problems is that leaders around the world in many spheres of activity simply don't understand the degree to which culture informs the way things are interpreted, even politics and economics. But I think as well that leaders are not very good in not so much puzzling out those meanings, but working with those meanings to see if there are ways to reach consensus on issues when people are using very different terms to describe the problem. Understanding culture a bit better, as I think, for example, cultural anthropologists have done, gives us that kind of leverage, that kind of, or at least that kind of access to the minds of others, which otherwise might be completely bewildering to us. And so it would seem to me, indeed I argue in this book and one of my last books, that it is crucial that cultural leaders, like all of us, understand how culture really functions.
Can you think of any specific sort of contemporary examples of either internal or international cultural conflict where it was either poorly or well managed by people in positions of either social or political leadership?
Well, I can think of one's closer to home and one's farther away. I think that there are serious problems, obviously, with people delegated to represent their regions in the United States in Congress, but work for the betterment of the state as a whole, of America as a whole, who are being confounded in attempting either to understand or interact with each other because they're using different terms to sometimes describe similar things. And were they more sensitive to these matters, I think we might have a better chance of a kind of discourse in America if there would at least allow a creative sharing of opinions as opposed to simply the assertion of fixed positions. But I think one can internationalize that. There has been, obviously since 9/11, a horror at the whole notion of jihad as it is at least defined in the Islamic community by certain kinds of radicals, most often those associated with Al-Qaeda. But jihad is a term both within, well, certainly within Islam, that has had former and very different uses. It has to do with a certain kind of self-discipline, not unlike the sorts of spiritual exercises associated in Roman Catholic practice with St. Ignatius. That, of course, have been taken. Those terms have been taken over by militants, and they've used them for their own purposes. But had we done a better job, it seems to me, of both informing people about the various meanings of this term and the way in which it's being abused by militants, our own views of the Muslim community worldwide would have been less, I wouldn't say severe, but less narrow, less angled in one direction. And so I think that a cultural reinterpretation of that term and of the way in which it's being used or abused by different communities of faith is something that's very important to do in order simply to negotiate the kinds of understandings that we need to use and develop to make our way down a very difficult path.
You talk a lot about the languages, the terms that we use, and sort of the significance of their symbolic meaning, and when we misinterpret that kind of language. And it makes me think of media representations and sort of the problematic way in which especially the American media uses terminology to identify both, in the case of Islam, different movements and different practices within the faith, but also the way that they sort of identify political positions in the United States. What role do you see the media in playing in terms of either helping or harming these cultural conflicts?
It's a very good point. Well, I think I would see the media mainly in harming, not helping these kinds of conflicts.
Unfortunately.
Because they, to begin with, provide no background to either the issues they're discussing or the kinds of understandings that might inform the way people act in response to such issues. But more than that, I think so they're not interested in background at all. And they're not very interested in context. What they give you is simply the shortest, most easily summarized description of who's against whom or who did what to whom. And this is, of course, very bad for the public as a whole. Mm-hmm. As a result of which we do not have a very well-informed public. And there are hard places to look in the media to find it, because if you look outside of places that are at least reporting the news with some effort to balance the minimum number of things they're telling us, elsewhere what you find is simply heads talking at each other, often screaming at audiences. And this not only makes, this not only doesn't help, it makes matters much worse.
One of the things that occurred to me when thinking about culture and the idea of sort of local versus global culture is the rise, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, of social media and of the internet as sort of a vehicle for culture. And one of the things that I talk about a lot with my students is the role that Twitter played in, the Arab Spring and in spreading a lot of news, but also terms from one part of the globe to the other. Do you see the internet and sort of internet culture and social media as being helpful or harmful or both to these kinds of problems that we see in other media?
Well, obviously, I think we would have to say it's both.
Okay.
And it's sometimes very difficult to sort of separate out better from worse. But the media and the internet and Twitter are with us. People cannot communicate with each other across immense divides of culture, history, tradition, instantaneously. And everybody is pretty much doing it. I think for people who make policy or deliberate on policy in any sphere of experience, part of the problem is to slow down the processes of reflection a little bit so that people can be truly deliberate and thoughtful in what they try to figure out. But Twitter is simply a part now of the environment of understanding, and we're just going to have to learn how to live with it.
And do you think that it helps to produce a more global kind of culture or a more global understanding? Or is it simply another vehicle of communication with possibilities for either understanding or conflict the same way that anything else is?
Well, it can enable certain kinds of understanding. It can enable communication, as I said, across these really extraordinary divides of people. It can let people know what's going on in different places. It prevents autocratic regimes from hiding some of the things they do. This started really with Tiananmen Square and the use of fax machines, which was able to get the news out.
Yeah.
And all of that is very exciting, as indeed was the kind of rapid interlinkage of people, both within the Arab world and obviously far beyond it, to let them know that great movements of change were in the process of developing. It didn't necessarily help us understand very well what actually occurred, because what didn't occur is simply a process of liberation, but something much more complex that we're still struggling to get a grasp of, certainly in the West, and that people even in the Arab world itself are trying to sort out and make sense of under very difficult situations, because bringing people together also allows them to show their differences, to enact them, perform them, and this simply makes the whole environment at once somewhat more accessible, but also more turbulent.
Would you say that the idea of a global culture is actually something towards which we should be striving? Now, you hear that a lot when you're talking about cross-cultural and transnational conflict. It's this idea that, well, we're moving towards a global culture. Do you think, one, is it possible to actually have a global culture? And two, if we could, is that actually something that's desirable?
Well, that's a very good question and a bit complicated. Global culture is sort of a brand name of the latest forms of communication, of our belief that we have, through these communicative forms, internet, some kind of access to the innermost meanings and feelings of people in different lands and from different cultures. That isn't actually happening. And from my point of view, in certain senses, that might not be a good idea. That is, if we think of a global culture as some unified whole, the chances of abusing that power and that uniformity of thinking or feeling, or simply that mode of organizing people's communications with each other is very troubling. In fact, I think what we have is a system that links people up in different ways, that enables them to interact in ways that are both, I think, useful, but also very creative. But that doesn't mean that the world is a seamless totality, a seamless whole. It doesn't mean that there isn't much underneath that presumption of unity that isn't expressive of radical differences of various kinds, some of which we can work with, and some of which probably we can't.
So in terms of how we can deal with this as, for instance, from the perspective of Jepson, a leadership school, in the sort of broader spectrum of things, major figures of political leadership need to sort of come to a better understanding of the other cultures that they're dealing with, whether inside a nation or outside. For instance, how would our students approach trying to reach a similar sort of position where they feel that they're broadening cultural horizons, or they're enabling those kind of conversations to be productive rather than reductive or destructive?
Well, it does seem to me, as I will be saying tonight, that everyone needs to have a better sense, not simply of culture, but of how even culture itself now needs to be thought against this much larger, more complex, but interactive global background. And that is, to begin with, something that I think leaders have to much better understand than they do. Many people tend to think, many of the leaders in this country certainly do, that culture is a kind of additive to life, a kind of icing on the cake, maybe a compensation for the otherwise hardness and ordinariness of experience. Other people think that it can be simply reduced to sort of hearts and minds, what people think when they somehow act and work and live together. Culture is, I think, much more essential than those things in a certain sense. It is the It represents the systems by which we make sense of our own experience. It comes in many forms: political, economic, social. In other words, cultural is not something differentiated over against these things.
Mm-hmm.
These meanings we associate with culture, and the instrumentalities that make us, enable us to use those meanings in the ways we do, very much affect the way we then think about these other things. And that is nothing that leaders can be insensitive to.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think some leaders are sensitive to this. But in any case, I think students in a program like yours need to have lots of exposure to how these things are constructed, that is, systems of meaning, and how they can be deployed in analyzing various kinds of situations. I am actually myself associated with a program of leadership in the master's program that we developed at the University of California at Santa Barbara back in 2005. It's a master's program which is a global master's program, but it's focused on the study of and the preparation of people to participate in and possibly become leaders in global civil society.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do think about the issue of leadership. And more important, we try to prepare people to think about that by, in fact, giving them a pretty heavy dose of an introduction to cultural thinking, how culture works, where our present views of culture come from, and how it's so often misused or confused when people try to move out into the sphere of politics and civil society to make it operate more effectively.
And one final question. A lot of times when people talk about culture, you hear this idea of tolerance and simply tolerating other cultures and other ideas. And from what I've read of your work, that doesn't seem to be your conclusion, that tolerance is going to be a productive way to come at a lot of this. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what we need instead of tolerance?
Well, I think we do need more things than tolerance, though tolerance by itself isn't absolutely bad.
Right.
We need to tolerate each other enough, at least, to begin to listen. But even as we listen, we need to know how to listen and what to listen for. In many intercultural forms of conflict and misunderstanding, it's often assumed that the only way any resolution of these conflicts or misunderstandings can be achieved is if we come to what sometimes we refer to as a common mind.
Mm-hmm.
That we begin to think alike about these things and share in very explicit ways what we define as the values in question or at stake. I think that's naive because I don't think cultural understanding, in fact, depends upon the fusion of one mind with another. It depends much more on simply the ability, which takes some art as well as some practice, to try to figure out, as you listen carefully, what the other is up to, what the other is trying to say. Perhaps in a language you don't understand, and no doubt with, or backgrounded by values with which you may not be very familiar. But if we make that effort, then I think something can be achieved that doesn't simply turn out to be a kind of acceptance of someone else's views over against one's own,
Mm-hmm.
but becomes instead a chance for each to share perspectives with the other that inform not just the conversation, but inform each of the participants about things they don't see very easily, but might see. That is, I think we need these exchanges in part because this is the only way, as I'll be saying again tonight, that we come as well to know about ourselves. These exchanges are, if you will, a kind of reflexive practice. They function almost as mirrors in which we can see in ourselves, in the way we're responding to others, undetected aspects of our alliances, our disagreements, our forms of blindness. So tolerance is, I think, not what we want. What we want is this kind of interaction that allows for exchange of opinion that is illuminating, not just for the conversation, as I said, but for both parties in it, or as many parties as there are participating.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful conversation,
You're very welcome.
and I look forward to this evening.
Thank you.